on a minute. Let me fix my video. Good morning and happy Sabbath. It's really good to be with you. Um, so when I chose this topic, um, I didn't realize that I was going to end up speaking on the day of International Women's Day. I think it's an interesting day, an interesting uh, pointing to the strife and struggle of women on an international level. And the website, International Women's Day website, has a really good history of how it began and why it began, and how women were fighting for equality. The other thing is that I'm going to touch on a few things that Phil mentioned about the disinformation against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election and against Kamala Harris in 2024. But I'm going to come from a totally different perspective. And so with that, we'll begin. So I've given the title, Women in Politics, Why So Much Violence? So we know women have been in politics and power for thousands of years. But I think the last I looked, out of 193 countries, I think women were in leadership of a nation was only, I think, 27 countries or 27%. Now I can't remember, but it was small. So I'd like to read a quote from an article in March of 2020 in the congressional representative Rashida Tlaib was the first person to ever enter the term violence against women in politics. And she had a 1-minute speech. And she came about with this term out of experience, along with other women in Congress. And I think there were 4 or 5 of them that were really pushing for a bill to prohibit such violence against women in Congress. So I'm going to I don't have a digital tablet and I don't know how to do Zoom whiteboard. So I'm going to just share a blank Word document and I'll type as we go, if that's okay. And I'll use a little bit of board work too. So I'd like us to explore what exactly is violence against women in politics. And I'm sure you're going to all be familiar with it. And today's study is really just scratching the surface. I did not realize the depth of this problem and how widespread and how old it is, but because I never saw it, I never like really narrowed it down to like political system and the attacks on women. So how would you define violence when you hear this term, violence against women in politics? Any thoughts?
First,
I
may
would
I
have,
ask if that can be blown up to 200%?
Oh, let me try.
Go to view, I think, and then zoom. It's the
How's that?
easiest. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I think
Anybody have any thoughts?
I used to think it was just physical, but now with going through my own past and through research, it's not just physical, it's also verbal.
Okay, good. not just physical, verbal. Okay,
It can also be psychological.
psychological, good one.
Definitely.
Okay,
Emotional.
emotional. Okay, one else.
Gaslighting.
Would that fall into psychological?
Probably.
I'll put it up there with it.
Susan says condescending.
Condescending. Would that be emotional? That would be is that right? Condescending.
I was thinking intimidation, but I don't know if that might already be included.
Well, so that would be in there, I think, because the physical, or the verbal and the psychological can all be really classified into intimidation.
How about Kathy, gesture, by your gesture?
So body language?
Yes.
That was-
Yeah.
Okay, body language. And how would that be violence against women? The way people respond to them? Is that what you mean? Okay.
Cognitive dissonance.
I'm not sure how that would be violence. Is that in the person committing the violence, or is that what you mean?
The person being made to be confused.
So I think that would fit into psychological and gaslighting.
Yeah,
So we
thinking about
have,
it now. Yes, you're right.
okay. Thank you, Joy. So traditionally, definitions, we think of violence would be just physical, and as Christine pointed out, it's more than that. But there is in the academic world, and I want to put up this scholar's name because I will be referring to a lot of her source material. Um, She has is at Rutgers University. She's involved in the United Nations and tons of organizations that are fighting for women's equality, but she has done significant study into the research of what originally began as a problem without a name. So that reminds me of 1963 and what was her name that wrote the book, Feminine Mystique? Frida?
Friedan.
For Dan.
Dan.
Yes, thank you. So she discovered when she talked with women that individual women were having the same problem. And her book brought that out. And so we have also now called that when it affects a group of individuals, that becomes the goes from the personal is political. So and then Rashida Tlaib was the first person to really give this a name. So academia has given the definition of violence. It's a violation of integrity. So from there, they talk about violence against Violence is an act that harms a person's autonomy, their dignity, their self-determination, and their value as a human being. So you can see that the definition now has gotten broader and encompasses the whole person, which we were able to see in the different categories of emotional, psychological, verbal, how it affects the person.
Kathy, can you
Yes.
repeat for me what name did Rashida Tlaib give to it?
It's called Violence Against Women in Politics.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And it is a global problem around the world. It's not just in the United States, which we're familiar, with our news feeds. We've certainly seen plenty of that. So she goes on to describe examples, categories of forms of violence.
Kathy, who is she in this point? Is it for
This
Dan?
is Mona Lena Crook.
Okay, thank you. Is that from a book you said?
It's from her book and some articles she's written profusely. If you Google her or look up on YouTube, you can get talks by her. Her book that I haven't read the whole book. I've only surfaced it. It's called Violence Against Women in Politics.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe when you're done, take a picture of your board, because when you share screen, we can't see you big.
Oh yeah, sorry.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
I will do that. Okay. One category is a rare one, and it is physical violence. And it is rare. She gave one example, two examples actually. A woman in, I think Brazil. Yes, a Brazilian politician, and she was running for office, and in 2018, she was assassinated. The violence against women in politics is not limited just to the woman who is running for office. The violence can actually spill over to her staff, people who are her supporters, knocking on doors, things like that, and activists. So it is it's not just things that happen to her, but of course then violence can affect, the threats can come to her family also. Another example of violence she gave was the arrest and torture of women activists in Saudi Arabia. And so that is, they're standing up for rights. I don't know the details of it. I just was giving this as an example, and I don't know if they were, well, it says they were activists, so I don't know that they were running for an office, but the fact that they were possibly driving a car when they weren't allowed, or doing something that has been declared not for women. Another form of, which we're familiar with, online abuse. So what are we familiar with on online abuse? Harassment, threats, trolling. Does everybody know what trolling means? I had to look it up to make sure I understood it. It's when you bait somebody by making a negative or rude, nasty statement so they would troll the candidate by making nasty comments about her or to her, just being a bully. So so what do you think would be the purpose of online abuse and trolling of women candidates? What do these people want to accomplish? I'm sorry, I'm not reading the chat.
I think it's intimidation. And then Susan puts in silence of the women, dog them and continually target them. And Anna's putting in bullying.
Okay, so the intimidation and the bullying are like the tool, and the result that they want is silence or to actually leave social media.
Yeah, and Elaine puts in break them, which
Break them?
would break them, which would silence them, like you said.
Yes, yes, because I can only imagine the scale. If you're in the public eye, the number of texts or emails that you receive, even and especially on a national level, but even in a local level, a state office or whatever, but a national level, you can imagine the sheer volume of the things that could be coming through the online. So yes, the goal is for silence.
Kathy,
Yes, Bob.
couldn't it also be that they're deliberately trying to provoke some type of an emotional response or a response that would then not be in that person's favor?
You know, there was I read a paragraph about that where women themselves gave their testimonies, and there was debate about do you respond? Do you ignore it? Do you go up higher and things? And it's interesting that silence was in the early days of women running in politics, silence was generally the first go-to, to just ignore it. And to then have to realize that the comments aren't about you. It's a lot bigger, right? Because it's systemic. Then later in the years, like in the 20s, 2020s and that period, maybe 2018, women then decided that, there's more, I'll talk about this a little bit further in here, but they then decided that they did need to respond, but they had to respond in a certain way. But I think I've got that a little bit further on here. So there's another form of category of violence, and that's economic. So it can be vandalism. So if you have a lot of campaign posters or signs that are in people's yards, maybe even hacking your website, which causes issues, then you have to get your IT people and things. What's the other one? Lawfare. You could get miscellaneous lawsuits against you and false accusations that would then take your time and take money. And then a fourth category, And I had to look this word up, and I'm going to give you the definition. And I had to learn how to say it. It's semiotic. And it includes semiotic violence, includes creating sexually explicit images of political women for the purpose of degrading their personal dignity and then to harm the public's perception of their suitability for public office. And I'm sure y'all have heard about this. I remember one, I don't remember if she was running for the Senate, but her face was put on the body of a naked woman. It was not her body, but they took her face and used that during her campaign. So and of course now with AI and deep fakes and all this, it is really prevalent as an attack against women.
Kathy,
Yes.
you can really see the similarities to how they tried to control the Black people with their same racist types, with the violence, the hangings, the economic abuse, the targeting them, like making them like caricatures and, you know, white face or black face, all that they did, right? To the same thing they do with the women.
So the racist handbook is now the gender handbook
Yeah, you
against
can really
women.
see the same tactic.
Yeah, yeah. And we know the source of all of that, right? So in my mind, we have seen, especially since 2016 and 2024, I don't know that I was paying that much attention to the elections before 2016, honestly, nor to so much about gender inequality either. But now it's like you can't go anywhere without seeing it. So these attacks are to one individual at a time, okay? And it amplifies the gender inequalities. These attacks are just on women as a group. And those attacks multiplied out, whether it's national or global, every woman running for office goes through this. It is suggesting to the general public that women as a group are unworthy to even participate in the public service sphere. So it's and you know what it's connected to, right? We'll get to that. But why would women not be allowed in the public sphere, especially in government? So it's seen as a threat, right?
That's why
So
it's called the manosphere, not women in manosphere.
yes. So there was in 2016, I'm sure you'll remember these things. There was, and I'm only going to name a few, but how she was called such a nasty woman. So was Kamala, nasty woman. Lock her up, hang her. And the recurring meme for all women, she's a witch. And you can imagine and may have even seen some of the memes online, some of the t-shirts where a black pointy hat is put on the head of the woman. Her face is green, she's in black, and she's riding a broom. I mean, Have you ever seen a man has that ever been done to a man? Anything on that scale? No. So these attacks are not driven by policy, right? These are attacks on women as a gender. And they're clearly sexist, they're clearly misogynistic, and they have a goal of intimidation. And the goal is to have women to question their rights to even participate in the political process. And the end game that the author is finding is that the end game is to literally exclude women from participating in public life. So we have talked about, well, and the reason, of course, is when women step up to participate in public life, whatever level that is, they have transgressed, they have broken the cultural expectations of the submissive femininity, right? And when women get in there and start debating and giving their opinions and having solutions, the stability of the patriarchal structure is called into question. It gets a little shaky, right? And it feels threatened. So we have seen then and agree on that these are methods to silence women, to intimidate women, and to ultimately, with the goal ultimately of excluding women to participate in this process. So, any thoughts? Would anybody like to share?
I'm just thinking about how it, along with race, how what you can do in the intimidation and violence to one, you can scare the rest from also wanting to be involved.
Right. I mean, if you were watching this, all these attacks on women, and you even knew this woman and you were aware of what was happening. I mean, and then you think about the threats not only go to her, death threats, rape threats, violence of all kinds, not only pointed to her, but to her family or even to her coworkers.
So the intimidation is widespread.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it keeps the whole population, or the attempt is to keep a whole population suppressed.
Right.
And in their place.
Yes. And where's their place?
In the home, barefoot and pregnant.
Yeah. Oh, so Lena Crook wrote an article in 2022, and she created a database of newspaper articles from around the world. And the time period was 2014 to 2019. And she came to a conclusion that from all those articles, she identified two modes of semiotic violence. And they are rendering women invisible and then rendering women incompetent. So to render a woman invisible, she says that these attacks, this violence seeks to erase women as political actors and then deny them their right to speak and be heard in political debates. So this is then using imagery, right? The semiotic is the images. And those images are powerful enough to, like Sal was talking about, disinformation can affect people. So these same images of horrific imagery of women, and even just simply if they were, I know there was a lot about Hillary in 2016 that she was unwell, and they kept showing these videos of her staggering or falling over and showing that, you know, she's not competent, she's not well, she shouldn't be running for office. And I think there was another one, oh, on Nancy Pelosi, they had a video. She was talking, and all they did was slow down the video speed just enough to make it appear that she was drunk. And again, and if that goes into your echo chamber, right? You don't even think it's fake. It just meets with your biased ideology. So the second semiotic mode was of incompetency. And what that they will do then is to reject women's qualifications to serve in political roles that are based on gendered images. And it's related to your temperament, your knowledge, sexual objectification, and femininity. And I'm sure you remember when Elder Tass showed us all those political cartoons about women and wanting to go for the vote, and how those drawings were just, you know, the women who wanted equal rights were drawn in the most awful looking ways. And then the women who were staying home with the babies were, you know, pretty and had the, you know, this whole princess thing going on. And she has concluded in that study in 2022 that semiotic violence is the most widespread, concealed, and trivialized form of violence against women. So by recognizing this, she said that this form of violence is important in for research and activists, so that a language can be created. Now, this is research that she's done, you know, 10 years ago. Again, this problem without a name, and women didn't have the language to try and describe the experiences that they were having as they ran for political office. And so having this knowledge now, they can challenge the structural inequalities that normalize these images that are against women. And yes.
Yeah, I was thinking how powerful that is to have the name and the evidence and facts about what that does, because if you think of like a caricature or something and say you complain about it, someone would say, well, don't you have a sense of humor? Where's your humor? Right? And they can make you feel like, yeah, male, maybe you're right. Or they have a way of silencing you, but by showing what this really does and putting a name to it gives power.
And what is one of the most common things women are told? You're overreacting. You're too emotional about it. You know what I mean? And it just totally gaslights you. So that's a good point, Susan. So she did say that these semiotic images of making women invisible and looking incompetent have the purpose to injure, to discipline, and to subjugate women. I mean, it's just so deep, and I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, there could be a lot of studies on this. So it is a global problem. It is uh, finally getting a name. It's being recognized, and women who are running in politics are learning how to navigate this as this awareness of this has been increasing. So one of the things that the author was wondering, like, why is this form of violence, these semiotic images, why are they trivialized? And she has come up with what she calls as barriers of recognition. So the first one she calls the cognitive gap. And this is where you normalize it, right? You're just like, oh, well, that's just the cost of doing politics. I remember growing up and having, catcalls as a young teenager, young woman, and you're like, just, you walk the next week, you don't walk in that neighborhood where the construction guys are, right? You normalize it. It's like, oh, that's just the way guys are. And then in that cognitive gap, you treat it as as an individual thing. You don't recognize that it's literally a structural problem in culture, right? The other barrier is the political gap. This is when women they will hesitate to speak. They recognize it, they see it, but they're afraid to speak out. Why? Why would they be afraid to speak out, to call this, whatever this attack was on them, this image that was wrong and false? Why would you be afraid to speak out?
Because of the history, whenever a woman speaks out, she gets attacked. And they've done that over and over again. So women will be afraid to speak out.
Yes. And they call that the weaponization by their rivals. And the woman is also, her other thought is not only will it be weaponized against her if she speaks out, but then she'll be seen as weak. So that's another issue. And so she's hesitant. She decides to speak out, even though it's going to make her look like she's going to feel like she's weak. And then whatever she does say, they weaponize it and use it against her. So, you can't win for losing, right? The other one is the receptivity gap. So she speaks out. Do they believe her? No. So she's not believed.
Do they even listen?
Right? And she's accused. What is she accused of when she speaks out? What card is she playing?
As the suppressor, the person
She's the victim.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but what card is she going to use? The gender card, right? She'll be accused of using the gender card for even talking about the violence that's done against her. And then last one is the resource gap. Women have no place to go to talk about this. And they have no language to describe their experience. And that's what this woman's book, which this is from, she eventually takes that and shows, she develops, in the book, she develops, actually part of it is in here, tools to help and understand the definition of the issue. Because, and when you think about how that term, violence against women in politics, it's very powerful. When I just kept thinking about that over and over, and like, it was such a problem that it had to be given a name. It had to be categorized, right? It's beyond, because she's seeing how that this affects democracy. This affects half the population of the world, and having their voices heard, and having topics debated, and even citizens having a choice onto who they're going to vote for. So this is huge. Any thoughts on these different barriers of recognition?
I was seeing the power of patriarchy even more in this because when you were talking about if a woman raises the gender issue, right? Then I was thinking, well, it worked for Clarence Thomas, right? And he's a man, and he
Mhm.
pulled the race card because he was being called on his sexist behavior. And it worked for a man, right? But it
Mhm.
doesn't work for a woman.
Mhm. Yeah, to me it gives me a deeper understanding of the structural strength of patriarchy in culture, because it's global, right? This is not just in a few countries, this is around the world.
Yeah, and Christine put in double standards. I was thinking higher standard. Women are called to a higher standard to survive, to get by. And then with number 4, the no place to go, any place
Mhm.
that may have existed, we know is being stripped away now as we speak.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because when you think about divide and conquer, these attacks, I mean, none of us, I don't know of anybody who's run for politics. I don't know what they go through. And this book and this topic has been helping me understand that. But think about how alone she must feel. And yet she isn't, because it's a global epidemic of attacks on women.
And
Do
actually
not,
interesting too, with the approach of you're taking just on focusing on politics, because where is it that there is a place to possibly bring change? And that's through the political system.
right, right. And it's been shown that when women, after they gained the vote, and then slowly women began running for office, that the types of bills that were presented in Congress were totally different.
Yeah,
And
yes.
they had to do with children and safety, health, women's rights, all that. It was those things came through the women. So, yeah, it's
That's why the efforts to compartmentalize the women again. If you can separate them and put them in their own space, back in their home, compartmentalize them, separate them, then you can break apart any power that they could glean by sharing similar experiences and speaking together with one strong voice. You'll separate them.
so what about, wouldn't that be like the extreme of that would be Afghanistan?
Yeah. Wow. Great point.
I mean, they're put in a
Yeah.
blue
Even in
bag.
public. Yeah.
They can't even open their windows. Their voices cannot be heard. I mean, no gathering with anybody. So they don't even have the opportunity to strengthen each other in their own enslavement. And even just try and get support.
Yeah. That's really
So
heavy.
it's a lot there. So she came up with a theoretical framework. And I'm going to make some space here to try and distinguish between two phenomena. And the first one is violence and politics. And this is the traditional view, traditionally understood. Okay. So in that framework, he says it's issue-based. So you implement your vision and your violence is directed against your political opponent. Men and women are affected by this traditionally based, issue-based violence, okay? Now, the product of this violence is a greater impunity for violence. And impunity means without consequences. So there are just no rules. You can just say and do what you like with this kind of violence without fear of retribution or legal law enforcement coming after you. And then there is gender differences. Well, gender and non-gender effects. So the sexual violence against, like you could take your violence against women supporters of the candidate, or it could be non-gendered violence. And then the final one is the democratic cost is seen. And basically, the person doing this violence gets their way through intimidation and force rather than the democratic process. Then she comes up with the other phenomena, and it's violence against women in politics. So The first one is issue-based. This one is identity-based, right? And it's gender. Because this violence is against women. And women, whoops, not one, wrong one. So the gender is women because they are specifically targeted. Men and women. Okay, so men and women up here are affected. In this one, it's only women are affected. And the product driven by patriarchal imperatives, rules, mandates. And so the patriarchal imperative, oh, I spelled that wrong, is that politics is man's space and women must be kept out. And the gender differences, the violence is gender and non-gender. And it can be sexual violence, assaults, and assassinations. And then the democratic cost is not recognized. Why? Why is it not recognized? Because the people who are committing the violence don't see it as, I don't know what the word is. They've normalized what they do, that's just part of the political process for them. And this type of violence against women doesn't get a lot of attention. Like ordinary political violence or issue-based violence. And but the main thing is that when you normalize things, it has less of an impact on you over time. And I'm sure you've heard in different newscasts and people talking like, don't normalize what's happening with the Trump administration, what they're doing, what they're saying. Don't normalize these attacks, these comments, because the repetition on the brain will affect you, and we have to stay alert. And she does say that women do experience both forms of violence. So I'm closing up on her portion of the study, and I'll just basically say that, summarizing all of this, that essentially women are attacked when they run as a candidate in politics because they are not seen as rightful participants in the political process. And women in politics challenge the status quo because they don't look like a typical older white male politician. So I'm going to switch to a different author, and she's doing this topic in a different way. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's written about, I don't know, 12 or 15 books. And her name is Eleanor Herman. And she wrote a book called Off with Her Head. And so now I'm going to pull a few things out from her book. She writes with a sense of humor, and she can be quite blunt. So I'm gonna be careful with language, because she was not restraining herself. So I want to start out with part of her introduction. So she reads a lot of books, and she was recently reading a biography of a famous woman. And here are a couple of comments about that woman that she wanted to point out. And this is the descriptions that she came across describing this woman. She's unlikable. She's untrustworthy. She's sexually depraved. She's disgustingly ambitious. She's a spendthrift, which means she's a wasteful, extravagant spender. And she busts men's testicles. What do you think she was reading about?
Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton? Anybody else?
Margaret Thatcher?
Margaret Thatcher? That's a good one too. She was reading the biography of Cleopatra. And those were the attacks against Cleopatra. So this is like, so Cleopatra, we know she was a woman in power. And the biography was her story, the rise and fall of Cleopatra, her power. But it was also about Rome's horror that a woman should wield this much power. So Eleanor saw the similarities in the attacks that Roman men were throwing at Cleopatra as similar to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, and it's not to say that, women don't make, they don't make all right decisions. Everybody makes mistakes. But what Eleanor discovered is that there is smear campaigns tend to use the same playbook. They come out with unfounded accusations, which is disinformation that Val mentioned. They accuse women of sexual improprieties, criticisms of her ambition, her untrustworthiness, her appearance, and her unlikability. And as we're aware of, that rarely do male leaders ever have those kinds of accusations hurled at them. So in this book, she goes through the history of a number of very famous women, going all the way back to Anne Boleyn, Catherine the Great, and then she comes up to, and I'm not listing them all, but she discusses Angela Merkel of Germany, Prime Minister Theresa May of the UK, the Prime Minister Julia Gillard of Australia, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. Remember the kidnapping plot that was discovered during the COVID time? And Senator Elizabeth Warren, and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. So again, she has shown that, and she found this thread of similarities of women in power that that they have been subjected to in these sexist takedowns. It's been around for ages. So the accusations have the purpose of creating a villain. And it has nothing to do with women's experience, their political mistakes, their policies, or their platforms. It is a way to create a name-calling caricature, to put an image, whether it's online, and then that image goes into your head, and then it's affected by your biases. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the terminology. She's treacherous, she's frigid, she's power crazed, her voice is shrill, she's a witch, she's ugly, she dresses poorly, she overdresses, her hair is wrong, her butt is big, she's angry, she's nasty, she's hormonally imbalanced and irrational, she's a bad woman, a bad wife, a bad mother, she's a sexy vixen, she's phony, she's unpresidential. And I left out the ones that use the vulgarity that is aimed at women regarding their gender, their looks, whatever, and they're just too vulgar to, to say. So the pattern is there. Mara Crook did not go back as far back as Eleanor did, but we are not surprised. We know how far patriarchy goes back. We know how far sexism and misogyny goes back. But it's now being aware of the depth of this patriarchal system, this misogyny, and this violence, how it is a focus group. It is women. It is specifically women. And the threats are real. The effect on your mental health, on your nervous system, right? Is that the sympathetic nervous system? Your fight, flight, or freeze is constantly under attack. And it involves not just yourself, but they always go after your family. And so it does instill fear, and you're definitely being intimidated. There was also, take a break. Anybody have any comments or thoughts?
Well, I don't know. You're doing an excellent job. I don't know how we explain this, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up. Even in the Bible, right? The whore of Babylon, or Jezebel, or the good woman Esther, right? And how she's portrayed. And we know that the Bible was written patriarchally, but yet those are the symbols, prophetic symbols that we use. But the woman is made to even be so awful, in the Bible.
I actually had an insight on that about how Eve, like the manosphere wants to see Eve as the root of all their problems, the cause of all their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And she must have been the weakest link. She must have stopped listening to God. Satan must have been stalking the humans and finding their weak spots, and it must have been Eve. Otherwise, it would have been written differently. Like the Muslim faith, it wasn't. They don't blame Eve. It's man who sins, who does the word of God, or does not obey the word of God. And when I told that to Parminder last year, or 2 years ago, he said something that I wasn't expecting. It was a perspective on how the Muslim men don't even give women the agency to have their own independent questions or thoughts.
Hmm.
And I found that interesting because that is something that the Bible does, is it allows women to have agency with choosing something not. And so I don't know, why does God focus on saving, like communicating with all of these men? Or is it, so there's another perspective, or is it simply that men are the only ones that recorded history? God certainly could have been speaking to women. Ruth was recorded. I don't know. Just about.
Yeah, that's a big subject. I don't know how to answer it.
But for women to be seen by the manosphere as the enemy,
Mm-hmm.
and can't let women into our world because they're going to destroy it. See what they did in heaven? The problem is all with them.
So I think in the men are okay with women who obey the rules. In fact, they'll be lifted up and praised, right? So I don't know that so it's really a
Look a
control
certain
thing.
way. If you look a certain way, if you dress a certain way, if
Mm-hmm.
you talk a certain way,
Right.
those rules.
You won't be attacked. So yeah, it's there actually I'm leading into an interesting definition of patriarchy by another woman. She wrote a book called The Curious Feminist, and she says patriarchy is the structural and ideological system that perpetrates the privileging of masculinity. And then she gives examples: legislatures, political parties, museums, newspapers, theater companies, religious organizations, corporations, and courts, all of which originate from the presumption that what is masculine is most deserving of reward, promotion, admiration, and emulation. What do you think about that definition? It's pretty good in the manosphere, doesn't it?
Well, if I'm being honest, that's why I didn't want to vote for Hillary, because she was emulating the man's world too much. But I ended up actually voting for Hillary in 2016. That was my first presidential election to vote for since Al Gore. But I didn't want to accept a woman in office that was pretty much just doing what the men had been doing previously, just conforming to their world.
Any other thoughts from anyone else?
It's just really interesting, so much to think about. And I know some of it's not that simple and straightforward, you know. But I was also thinking about Dana White and I believe he just signed with Saudi Arabia to promote some kind of $10 million deal to promote the UFC kind of fighting, that the men's fighting that's so popular, the cage fighting, all of that fighting that they like, which is promoting the masculinity, and that's heading now to Saudi Arabia. But you can just see how it's just taking over everything,
Yeah. Yeah. So, the Eleanor goes on to describe about patriarchal oppression worldwide and in cultures. So she just gives a few examples. Foot binding in China, harems in the Ottoman Empire and other cultures, bride burning in India, burqas in Afghanistan. And then she ends with rape everywhere and every era. So putting that in the definite oppression category. So we can see, right, that misogyny and patriarchy are interconnected. And the author describes it as a way that misogyny is like the mechanism to maintain and reinforce the patriarchal structures, which then enable privileged men, and which privileges the men and subordinates the women. So misogyny is against women as a group, and then patriarchy rules over women as a group. Any thoughts?
Okay, so can we say misogyny can be another way of labeling the manosphere? Are they equal?
So misogyny is actions against, is a ideology against women. So I'm wondering if it's both with the manosphere, misogyny and patriarchy. But the way she's describing this is that the misogyny is the visible actions that supports possibly the hidden structure of patriarchy, is how I was thinking about it. So the intimidation, the sexism, all of that, those attacks against women is misogyny, which is supporting the patriarchal system to rule over women and keep them subjugated. Because look at what's happening with women who step up to go into public office. They're punished. This intimidation, these attacks is a tool of patriarchy to silence women who are challenging male power, which I'm not sure that that's what a woman thinks about when she decides she wants to run for office. She wants to serve her community, but that's not what it's seen as from patriarchy. How dare you stand up and go into this public space that is male only, and you are breaking the unwritten rules of behavior.
Disrupting our status quo.
Yeah, yeah. And then what do? You become a role model for other women. And what do they now want to do, right? And they see that. It is seen, that system, and I don't know how to, it is systemic. So there's these generations of biases and discriminations, and all of that comes out. And the root is Satan, right? It's satanic. Almost done here. So the Eleanor gives you some clues, some tips on how to, if you're unsure that something is violence against women or if it's a justified criticism. So here's her thoughts. Are you analyzing her, oh, wait a minute. Criticisms. So, are you analyzing her actions, her experience, her speeches, right? Shape. Sorry about that. Shady deals, lies, right? Or are they attacking her appearance, her voice, her personal relationships? Remember the district attorney in Georgia and her personal relationship? I mean,
Yes, I have a comment on that too, Kathy, when you're finished there.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Latent, sexist words. I spelled that wrong. Okay. And then using vague words like she's a phony, she's unlikable, shrill, etc. So you can then sift the things that are being said, and generally they're pretty visible. Okay, was that Donna that had a comment?
No, it's Jackie.
Oh, Jackie, sorry. Go ahead, Jackie.
Yes, now you're making a point here on which one of these from, I just have been reading about Brad Ratzenberger, or Rats. These men that are in charge of elections, people that are, really have a high position with the vote count. And in this case, it says that these men that oversee elections have shared how the women in their lives have faced threats as well. So in Brad's case, he wasn't attacked personally, but his family was. His wife received disgusting and vulgar threats. His daughter-in-law's home was broken into, and it was believed that she was targeted because to intimidate him, her
Wow.
father-in-law.
Wow.
Isn't that something? I was just thinking of this.
Yeah.
How many of these cases where these men in politics have
and then
had
they blame the
women in their
woman,
lives attacked, not the man himself?
Yeah. Well, it can't be his fault. It must be his wife. She's not a good mother. She's not a
Exactly.
good wife. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She intimidates him. She's wearing the pants in the house, things like that.
Yes,
Wow.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Amazing.
in that attack, they're saying maybe this man will just step down too.
Right. Interesting.
It's so far reaching.
It really is. It really is.
Absolutely.
So there's another way to, if you're not sure a statement is sexist, and I've used this one a lot with some of my coworkers when I'm trying to talk to them about things. And And like, well, you make it that someone makes a statement to them and it's sexist, and like, oh, it's just no big deal. And I'm like, well, let's just change the pronoun, right? Let's change the gender. So here are some examples that were said to women, and now we're going to change the gender. He doesn't have the right sort of body to be on TV. He doesn't seem loyal at all, but very opportunistic. He should have a little modesty. Should a father of 5, including an infant with Down syndrome, be running for the second highest office in the land? Aren't his priorities misplaced? Unbelievable, he wore the same suit in the same week. His voice makes you envy the deaf. And he launched his political career in the bedroom by sleeping with a powerful woman. Has anybody ever heard those kind of comments coming to a man? No. You can hear how ridiculous it sounds, right? And another tactic, she says, is to consider the men as women. So if you take Donald Trump and say Donna Trump, and then everything that he has said and done, if he had done that as a woman, would he have been elected? No. So same with Hillary. If she had been, look at it as a male and all her credentials and everything, would she have received the treatment that she received? And I doubt that. So close to closing here, I do want to read a couple of things from some quotes from some congressional women from the United States. Congressional Representative Presley stated, quote, "Violence should not be the cost of exercising women's political rights. We have every right to do our jobs and represent our communities without fearing for our safety." Representative Jackie Spear called the violence that she and her colleagues have experienced in Congress as a form of weaponized sexism. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you may remember when a colleague called her a very vulgar 2-word term and extreme profanity, and she described what happened to her as is a cultural problem, one in which men feel entitled to accost women without remorse and with a sense of impunity. And she said this is not just one incident. So she took it to a higher level, and she took it right to where it belongs in the culture. And so it was hard for them to respond to that. And then
I got a question really quick.
Sure.
About that, because there are women that are allowed into the man's world, the patriarchal world. We see that with Lori Loughlin, the Marjorie Taylor Greene, Boebert, many other women. Either they're left alone by other men, they're not negged like these Democratic women are, or they're not negated, they're not treated the same, or they're just not speaking out against it because they're helping uphold this patriarchal system, who wouldn't say anything negative against men abusing them. But I don't know.
I think they still get some form of sexism and misogyny. I mean, because there was even some article I read that, Marjorie Greene is a very vocal supporter of Donald Trump, and she didn't get any appointments in his administration. And I can't remember the source of the article, and I didn't do a deep dive into it, but it was mentioned that she didn't meet the looks standard, the beauty standards of Trump, which would, to me, make
She's too
total sense.
masculine. She works out too much. She's too masculine.
Yeah, I mean, so it's still there, but they're working. I mean, it's, you know what I mean? There, again, we know that there's women that, they're part of the system and don't recognize it. I think we've talked about that before. You know, I didn't understand patriarchy. I lived in it for how many decades without realizing it even really existed. So yeah, that's a good point. It'd be interesting to look into that. So I'll go ahead and close with, this is from Lena Crook, and it's in the Journal of Democracy. She wrote an article in 2017. Attempts to stop women as a group from participating in politics are attacks on the rights of half the world's people. Sabotaging the campaigns of female candidates or inhibiting female office holders from fulfilling their duties strikes at the integrity of the electoral process and violates the rights to vote and to see democratic choices respected. Such actions deprive citizens of exposure to full debate and to the contributions that women can make to solving society's problems. On that note, I'll close. And if anybody has any thoughts they'd like to share before we end, that'd be
Yeah, I
okay.
just wanted to add one comment. I've always seen it as whatever group, women, sexism, nationalism, and homophobia, whatever group that is targeted and has been targeted when it comes to equality, I've always seen it as being forced to have to be like a salmon trying to swim upstream, and everything that you have to do is harder and takes more effort and more abuse and there's a word I'm looking for, but going against you the whole way.
Yeah, good point. Anybody else? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and I'll close in prayer. Holy God, we praise you and thank you again for this blessed Sabbath day to look at these systems that are so violent against women, and they have been for generations and generations. We thank you for helping us to see and to understand. Give us light, lead us and direct us as we journey, navigate through these internal and external events. We praise you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.